of the China Society. Oh, okay. I'm Bob Lee, the president of China Society of Southern California. This is a joint program sponsored by the China Society and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. This program is being recorded. There will be a question and answer session. Please type your question and answers in the question and answer box. Okay, let's begin. I'm not a gourmet. I'm not a foodie or a restaurant hopper. However, I am fond of watching food shows on PBS. Two of the issues on Chinese restaurant foods are, is it authentic and does the diner like it? Often these two do not coincide. The Chinese restaurant serves two groups of diners. One has a Chinese background, the other does not. Both groups have changed over the last 60 years. I want to make some observations about the non-Chinese group. 60 years ago, America was predominantly white. While there were regional foods, it was essentially a meat and potatoes cuisine. The frozen TV dinner was a hit. This was pre-Julia Childs and pre-James Beard. Food ingredients were seasonal and local. Chinese vegetables and even canned and dried Chinese ingredients were not available outside of Chinatown. International travel and tourism was expensive and limited. Today, the non-Chinese group in America is multiracial, and with the white population being less dominant. The food scene is much more sophisticated and worldly. International travel and tourism is commonplace, and there's a great exposure to foreign and exotic cuisines. There are food and cooking shows on television and on the mass media, which encourage the sampling of many different cuisines. You can learn how to fix almost any kind of food on YouTube. A friend asked me the other day how to fix sea cucumber. I don't know how many of you know what sea cucumber is, but it's a delicacy for the Chinese. Anyway, I didn't know, so I went on YouTube. There are at least 10 sites on YouTube that show you how to fix sea cucumber. Foods that were seasonal are now available year-round. Many supermarkets have international food sections that stock not only ingredients, but also pre-packaged mixes of dishes for the Chinese. Getting back to Chinese restaurants, for the non-Chinese, 60 years ago, Chinese restaurants were exotic. However, the Chinese restaurants did not want to be too exotic or too intimidating for the non-Chinese. For example, Chinese restaurants tend to have many dishes listed on their menus. The courses are usually listed in Chinese and English, and people order a la carte. Restaurants like the Golden Dragon, where the China Society regularly met, also have an additional Chinese menu, which might include village dishes or other courses such as tendons, kidneys, and pork belly, some which are not all that appetizing to the non-Chinese diner, especially in the 1960s. This multitude of choices made it difficult for the novice diner to order. To make things easier for the diner, the waiter, and the kitchen, Chinese restaurants had, for the lack of another name, an American menu section on their menus. I do not know when this type of menu began. Perhaps some of you can tell me, but it made ordering easier for the novice. Typically, these meals included a cup of soup, an appetizer, choice of 2 entrees, rice, and a fortune cookie. For each additional diner who was added to the party, another entree was added. The appetizer, usually fried wonton or an egg roll. Some of my Caucasian friends said the appetizer was the best part of the meal. The food was served family style, which meant that the entrees were shared. Food in Western restaurants usually are not served family style. Perhaps you have been to a Chinese restaurant and a table next to you that has a party of non-Chinese. Each diner orders individually. Sometimes 2 of the diners orders the same course. When the food arrives, they don't share the courses. Isn't that a shame? Today, the American style menu is not as prevalent. Many of the non-Chinese diners today are repeat customers who are very knowledgeable with Chinese food and wouldn't settle for these limited menus. I think the second issue is one about how does the food taste to the diner? In Jim Lee's Chinese cookbook, which is this, it is a cookbook that was printed in 1968, and the author is from New York City, and he gives some insights on this issue, and I want to read a paragraph from it. It's kind of interesting. He writes, I had a favorite Chinese restaurant where I took friends, and the must dish was lobster Cantonese. Some of these non-Chinese friends enjoyed the dish so much that they would go back to themselves and were invariably disappointed. They would complain to me about favoritism. I did a little investigation by keeping my eyes open and my ears open in Chinese restaurants. To my great amusement, the waiters had appointed themselves as censors of this dish. They signaled the chefs how to cook in 3 different ways. If the customer was non-Chinese, they will call to the cook Chao Long Ha, which means lobster Cantonese. How to become a bland concoction, which can only be legally identified as the item in question. Supposing those same customers said to the waiter, last time I came here with a Chinese friend, it was much better and I want it that way. The waiter calls to the kitchen, Chao Long Ha Tong Zhong. Translation, lobster Cantonese, Chinese style. The cook will season the dish with a bit strongly by adding a little garlic. Now it comes out pretty close. The perceptive customers are still not completely satisfied. So the next time they bring their Chinese friend again and he orders. He says to the waiter, Chao Long Ha, the exact same phrase which produces the anemic concoction before. But this time the waiter calls Chao Long Ha Tong Zhong, Tong Yan He, loud and clear. Out comes the dish with all of the tantalizing glory. What are the magic words? He said, lobster Cantonese, Chinese style, eaten by Chinese. I think I want to give 2 other examples of whether Chinese food tastes good or not. I think some of you know that my family owns a Chinese jewelry store in Chinatown that also sells antiques. One of our specialties is snuff bottles. We belong to a Chinese snuff bottle society that has annual conventions in various cities. In the early 1970s, after attending a convention, I visited a dealer friend who lives in New York. He is also a well-to-do wholesale jeweler. He had an apartment on Madison Avenue across from Central Park. It was quite a plush apartment. He was showing me the apartment and I noticed the bathroom. And he said, oh yes, I had just got it remodeled. It cost me around $10,000. At the time, my sister had just bought a 4-bedroom house in Cerritos, and the entire house and lot was $50,000. And his bathroom didn't even have a bathtub. Anyway, he invited me to a Chinese restaurant, his favorite Chinese restaurant in the neighborhood. And it was quite a plush restaurant in Upper New York. The chinaware was beautiful. The silverware was beautiful. The place was packed. He ordered, and I was terribly disappointed. He seemed to like the food, and it was because at the time, Chinese food was not authentic to me, but it was what the people in the neighborhood wanted. Another case I had was at another convention, and this was a few years later. And this was held in Honolulu. So I had a little time before the convention, and I invited 2 Caucasian friends who were both elderly and both from Baltimore. And I took them to a Chinese restaurant. And at the time, Mandarin cuisine was very popular in Los Angeles. So I took them to this Mandarin restaurant in Honolulu. And I ordered some courses. And when the first course came out, I realized that, gee, this is a Cantonese cook trying to cook Northern style. And it didn't taste anything like the Mandarin food that you get in LA that was cooked by people from Taiwan. And one of the courses that we got was, what do they call it? It's the one where it's like a Chinese burrito. Mushi pork. And when it came out, I was really kind of shocked because instead of having the wrapping that was so nice and thin, they were serving it on a Mexican flour tortilla. So that was, I think, the first case of fusion food in Hawaii. And while I was disappointed with the food, my guests liked it very much. So I think it's a matter of taste. Anyway, now I want to go on to the better parts of the show. I want to introduce Jong Chen, who is a professor of history from UCI. He has written a very, very good book on Chinese food and the history of Chinese food, and is continuing to study restaurants and Chinese food in America. His book is called Chop Suey. I'd like to turn over the program to him now. Please welcome Jong Chen.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Jean, for having me. And thanks, everyone, for coming to the event. Let me first try to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint so that you could, let me see. Can you see it? Yeah, I wish we could have this event in Colin and Pam's restaurant, the New Moon. Right? because that would be the best environment to have this dialogue on Chinese food. But that's something that we cannot do because of the pandemic. And so on the screen, can you see my screen, Jean? Yeah, okay, so it's working. Yeah, so here's the list of the things that I plan to talk about. I know it appears to be very ambitious. I'll be very mindful of time, of your time, and so that we can have time to hear from Colin and Pam, as well as Jean and others. I really hope that we can have some time for a conversation towards the end of this event. Okay, so basically, what I'll try to do is to provide some historical context, right, about when and why Chinese food came to the US and the extent to which it has become successful in the restaurant landscape in the US. And then, I'll move on to a more local setting, Chinese California, right? I'll talk about the changes that have taken place since the 1950s, but especially after the passage of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. Okay, so let's begin. And I know the audience is muted. Sorry about that. But please feel free to write down to share your questions in the chat space. Okay, so that we can continue this dialogue at the end of the event. So in the beginning, let's take a very quick look at when Chinese food first arrived in what is now the US, right? In talking about that, I just wanted to remind everyone of the significance of immigration as perhaps the single most important and powerful vehicle for the global travels of cuisines, right? So if you think about the cuisines that have become popular or are on their way to popularity in the US, food, ranging from Italian to Vietnamese cuisines, all of these are very closely related to the process of immigration, right? So the arrival of Chinese food is no exception. It came along with the Chinese 49ers, meaning the Chinese who came to California during and shortly after the gold rush, right? And so that's when Chinese food first arrived in the US. Okay, and initially, almost until the 1960s, I should say, an overwhelming majority of immigrants coming from China came from a region in Guangdong province in South China called the Pearl River Delta. So basically the food that brought to the US was Cantonese. Okay, so when speaking of Cantonese or Chinese food, there were actually two kinds of them, which brings me to the next slide, right? And those two kinds actually competed for non-Chinese customers, right? The result was the victory of, if you can read the screen, Chop Suey over shark's fin, right? Chop Suey here represents a more simple, down-to-earth, inexpensive kind of family cooking. And the other one is more upscale, more time-consuming to prepare, kind of cuisine. The Chinese actually tried to introduce the latter to American diners, both in China and in the US, but never succeeded. Okay, and it was the choice of American diners, and that made Chinese food, the first kind of Chinese food, very popular in the US, and that I refer to as the bifurcation of Chinese food in the US, right? And that led to the emergence of what many Chinese Americans in the restaurant business back in the early 20th century referred to as Chinese American cuisine, right? Nowadays travelers from China call this kind of a food Americanized Chinese food. Okay, so this is the menu from a restaurant in Baltimore back in the 1920s and 30s. It helps to visualize this bifurcation, right? So this is a 2-page menu. On my left hand side, you have the Chinese American cuisine, right, which is tailored to the palate of non-Chinese customers. On this side of the cuisine, you have the Chinese of the menu. You have the Chinese cuisine, even with Chinese characters. Okay, so that's the bifurcation of Chinese food in the U.S. Okay. And in the beginning, I talk about the importance of immigration as probably as the driving force, the single most important driving force behind the global travels of cuisines, right? So, to understand the significance of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, we need to start with the 1882 Chinese Extrusion Act. That actually was the first of a series of Chinese Extrusion Acts. Okay, so this act basically did 2 things. The first one was to ban Chinese labor immigration for 10 years, a ban that was eventually extended and over and over again and became permanent in 1904. And also it reaffirmed the legal principle, which was first established in the 1790 Naturalization Act of the US. The principle that only white people can become naturalized US citizens. So the 1882 Act reaffirmed that principle by noting again that the Chinese immigrants were ineligible for naturalization. Okay, so this is why the 1965 Immigration Act was a landmark event, a turning point, an act that really changed the face of America, the racial, the demographic characteristics of the nation. One of the main things it did was to abolish the racist quota system. Okay, and the Chinese received, as a category, received a quota of 2,000. Which initially went to Taiwan. Okay, so, and that, because of that, the gastronomical landscape of the US, especially of the Chinese restaurant industry, started to change. The number of immigrants increased and the number of restaurants increased. In addition, American diners were exposed to regional cooking traditions of China outside Guangdong province for the first time. And so here is a slide that shows the gradual increase of the number of Chinese restaurants after 1965, right? By the 1980s, Chinese food became the most popular ethnic cuisine or just cuisine in the US. That continues to grow. And, based on the most recent estimate by an organization called the Museum of Food and Drink, located in Brooklyn, Manhattan, there are about 50,000 Chinese restaurants in the US. In other words, we have more Chinese restaurants than the combined number of McDonald's, of Kentucky Fries, Burger King, and so on and so forth. Okay, and another way to appreciate the popularity, the significance of Chinese restaurants is that out of every 10 residents, there is at least one Chinese restaurant, and for every 15 restaurants in the U.S., one of them is Chinese. Okay, so I talk about American diners being exposed to non-Cantonese regional cooking of China. There have been individuals who did that. One of them is Cecilia Chiang. Okay, we don't have time to take a closer look at her bio, a fascinating story. An amazing chef, and also an amazing ambassador of Chinese food. And there's a wonderful video. I just don't have time today to do that. And then this introduction of non-Cantonese regional cooking of China to the U.S. was also achieved by newer immigrants, new Chinese, immigrants who arrived in the U.S. after the passage of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, beginning for the most part in the early 1970s. As I mentioned, the 20,000 quota, annual quota was given to Taiwan basically. So the initial Chinese immigrants coming to the U.S. came from Taiwan. Okay, and what is interesting to note that they did not, those newer immigrants did not settle in old Chinatowns. Rather they went to the suburbs, right, creating what scholars have called the suburban Chinatown or suburban Chinese communities. Okay, Montrose Park is one of those, and where they opened restaurants. The restaurants served foods very different from the kind of cuisine that you would find in Chinatown, and that raises a very interesting question. So, what is Chinese food? Okay, that is $1 million question, right? I'm going to go over briefly talk about 3 basic features of what makes the food of China, the cooking of China, Chinese. Okay, the first of all is a long history of development of cooking traditions, but also a long history of recognition by outsiders. Okay, this goes back at least to the Southern Song dynasty. Okay, and another feature is very similar to very different from French food, but similar to Indian, to Italian cuisines. Chinese food is a combination of numerous fabulous regional culinary traditions, including Sichuan, Hunan, Northwestern, meaning Xi'an, and so on, and so forth. Okay, so the third feature of the cooking of China is that it is a process. Right? People have asked me this question all the time: what is authentic Chinese food? Right? My answer is, it's a process. It's a process. It's not a static a state. And what is interesting to note is that the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in the U.S., okay, have provided a very important environment where Chinese food, the cooking of China, has continued to innovate, to change, right? So in Peru, you have a chifa, right? And, the list goes on and on. Okay. And when we talk about changes in the Chinese food, Chinese restaurant industry, right? There are several landmark events. The 1965 Immigration Reform Act is one of them. Another one is Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Okay. By the way, this picture is from a museum exhibit that I co-curated in the Museum of the Chinese in the Americas, which then moved on to Philadelphia in the Atwater Kent Museum. And in the following slide, you'll see 2 more pictures of this exhibit. Okay, and so speaking of the innovation, the changes that the Chinese restaurant industry has been making, right? Here's an example of that. That was probably the first the first Chinese drive-through restaurant in Southern California. Okay, and this was in response to many challenges that the Chinese restaurant industry started to face by that time. One of them is growing competition, okay, from other restaurants, from other ethnic cuisines, but also from other Chinese restaurants. Okay, so I went in. I've never worked in a restaurant, shame on me. But I get that, working as a consultant for this restaurant, gives me to stand behind the counter. Another source of innovation, inspiration, post-reform China, and the Chinese economic takeoff that really improved the life of hundreds of millions of people over there, but also the restaurant industry. Okay, and so recent years, many more Chinese have come here, and they have come here with a lot more what we call middle class resources, or cultural or financial capital, right? So as a result of that, we see a trend, right? First, of new Chinese restaurants arriving in Southern California, but also in other parts of the country, ranging from Houston to Flushing, New York City. Okay, and those are more upscale restaurants in comparison with the old family style, family operation Chinese restaurants. Okay, and so here's actually a good example. In Tustin. I'm from Orange County, so I'm going to use examples from mostly examples from Orange County. So this is a restaurant that just recently opened about a month or so ago, serving Northwestern Chinese food. I just want you to see the decor and the food, okay, of this fabulous restaurant. Okay, and also very expensive. Yeah. And that has been very much a trend. Yeah. Okay, so let's just stop here. And another example is a restaurant in Temple City. It's called Bistro Nas. One of my favorites. Okay, as those of us who love food know, the Michelin Guide had been absent from Southern California for about 10 years. And finally, it came back in 2019. And when it came back, it awarded a Michelin star to about, I think, 26 restaurants. And one of those restaurants is Bistro Nas. Okay, it's a fabulous restaurant featuring Northern Chinese food, imperial style. Okay. And here's the inside, the dining room. Okay, and here's another food. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Irvine too, right? But a few words about the city of Irvine, right? And when I was interviewed by the Los Angeles Times a few years ago, I coined the term postmodern Chinatown to characterize Irvine, because the Chinese community remained rather invisible, right? Especially in residential patterns. Okay, and there's a high-tech, there's growing cluster of high-tech industry companies here. And finally, I said this was that destination of established Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans, coming from other U.S. cities, right? But the new immigration pattern represents a challenge to the last point, because a lot of people, Irvine now is one of the most favorite destinations for new Chinese immigrants coming from Irvine, coming from China. Okay, so that's another inspiration. When they come, they brought with them, not directly, but companies follow them. Right, food companies, restaurants, and here's another one. Right, this is a restaurant that represents another trend in China, but also among the Chinese, especially the newer immigrants in the US, the popularity of hot pot. This actually has been noticed by the Los Angeles Times, which did an article about hot pot in Southern California. And so this is an extremely hot, extremely popular restaurant. It has been named as, has been ranked number 9 of all the restaurants in the world in terms of revenue and also in terms of the number of stores. And there are 4 of them in Southern California. And the picture that you see on the screen is the store located in Irvine. Extremely popular still, long lines. You can get in. Another source of inspiration, right? The Chinese diaspora. That's why I call Hong Kong and communities in Southeast Asia. Okay, and Taiwan is another source of inspiration. Okay, so Din Tai Fung, which used to have 2 stores in Arcadia, right? Now it has changed its strategy to building stores in shopping malls. And here is the location, is the store in South Coast Plaza, okay, which by the way is the biggest shopping mall in the U.S. in terms of sales volumes. It has had that status for almost 10 years. How long is the wait before the pandemic? It could be as long as 4 or 5 hours. Seriously. Okay. But during the pandemic, the store is empty, as well as the whole South Coast Plaza. When people are allowed to go to eat, to shop. Okay. So Taiwan, Din Tai Fung is from Taiwan, right? So when Taiwanese immigrants first arrived in the US and opened restaurants in the years after 1965, they did not promote their food as Taiwanese, right? Now they do. So here's based on an incomplete survey for a study that I'm doing right now. Here is the number of restaurants branding themselves as Taiwanese restaurants. Okay, it's growing. Okay, and one of them is called Class 203. It has three different stores, 2 in Irvine. And here's a picture of me with Mark Bittman, who used to be a food critic for the New York Times, a fabulous food writer, and who has a very, very big following. The tall guy behind me, that guy. Okay, so so I'm going to show you, some pictures of the second store of Class 302. Okay, so the setting is based on that of a school class in Taiwan from a certain time period. Okay, so in this little restaurant, right, you can see larger trends, right? One of them is the growing popularity of boba, right? So if you have not tried boba, find time to do so either tomorrow before long. It's extremely popular now, not only among Chinese Americans, but also other Asian Americans, especially the younger generation. Okay, so very wide selection of boba tea flavors. Okay, and also if you look at the extensive menu, right, you can see the convergence of food, the different local foods within Taiwan and in China. Okay, but they are all represented here. One of them is beef noodle soup, which is something that I'm going to talk about very briefly in just a minute. Okay, and so I have picked out a few of them to show why this is a convergence of different food traditions. Here you have the pig feet in rice noodles, right? This is actually a Hakka food. It's a Hakka dish. Okay, fried rice with fried rice noodles with pork intestines and oyster, right? So here's from another town. It's called Keelung, okay, in North Taiwan. And here, rice noodles is from central Taiwan. And so let's briefly talk about the beef noodle soup as a convergence point of convergence of historical forces. It was brought to China by the Chinese 49ers, not Chinese 49ers a century ago, but Chinese 49ers who fled China before the victory of the Communist Party, fled to China, to Taiwan in 1949. And then in the 1950s, it has also to do with USA to Taiwan that started in the 1950s, which made possible for people to have beef and to have a flour, wheat-based food. And in China, it has developed. It went to China, developed a new identity, right? Pictures of Taiwanese beef noodle in China, and in some places, this is marketed as a California beef noodle soup, right? A transformation of identity, which has to do with the last theme that I want to touch upon today, which is the international travels of Chinese food. Okay, have always been multi-directional, right? Food coming and it's also a multi-layer process, right? People go food going to Taiwan first or Southeast Asia first before coming to America, and by the same token, you also have the Chinese American cuisine going to China and Taiwan, right? So one Chinese American partnered with a Caucasian guy, and they opened a restaurant called Fortune Cookie in Shanghai, selling Chinese American cuisine. Okay, and Chop Suey, which is a part of the title of my book, has gone to Taiwan. Okay, so in conclusion, this is the story of Chinese food in California, Southern California in particular, is a global one. It's actually, right? It has to do with the immigration and changes in immigration patterns of the Chinese coming to the U.S. And this is very much related to the history of the U.S. and to that of Chinese Americans. And also, it's a window in which to understand shifts in Sino-American relations. Okay, so I want to conclude by saying that the development of Chinese food in Southern California after the 1960s shows the increasing divisions, even and the diversity among the Chinese community in our region. Okay, thank you all for your time. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Our next two panelists are Colin and Pamela Tom. Many of you remember Pamela because she was at the first joint meeting of the Chinese Society and the Chinese Historical Society. Of course, she was in a different role at that time. She is the producer and director of the movie Tyrus Wong, the movie. And all of us, I think, enjoyed that. And I was really surprised that she also had a restaurant background. Anyway, both Colin and Pamela are members of a third-generation Chinese restaurant. It was very local. The New Moon. I remember the New Moon because my father would go there to get dim sum. And dim sum was a rarity at the time in the late 1950s, I think, and they were the only place to go to get it. And he who was based in Los Angeles downtown, the new Chinatown, would go all the way to the San Pedro Market, Chinatown, to get dim sum for us, and it was really a treat. So without further ado, I'd like Pamela and Colin to give the story of their families and the restaurants that they have now.
Thank you, Bob, for that introduction.
Hello, everybody.
Colin, I'm Pam. Young, that was really fascinating. It really helped me with our presentation. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And okay, all right, bear with me here. Here we go. All right, let me know if you can see this. Can people see this?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. So we weren't around, obviously, in 1936. So what research we did was based on cobbling together some oral history. So I'm not a historian, but I am a filmmaker. So I love research, but I don't know if I have our story entirely right. But I did see in the chat that, or not in the chat, in the whatever, the images that my Auntie Helen is here. So if she's able to, you know, get on the chat, I might ask her some questions. Okay, so the story of the new moon starts with this man, Dick Tom Sr., our grandfather. He had his father had a grocery store called the Wing Chun Lung in Old Chinatown. And in 1935, I believe, they relocated to the Market District, San Pedro Street, in anticipation of the Union Station being built and the shutting down of Chinatown. So this was the 900 block between 9th and 10th on San Pedro, and some of the businesses were a pool hall, a soda fountain, little odds, just whatever, an assortment of places, and a coffee shop called Yi Yuan, which served cherry pie, apple pie, roast beef, egg foo young. So I'm not sure what that is called, but it's American and Chinese food. Let me see, in the early 50s, I don't know the date, the owner of Yi Yuan left and my grandfather took it over and renamed it New Moon. They served home style, family style, I guess, Chinese food. And my Uncle Grant said that one dish that was very popular was this noodle dish that they bought, the noodles they bought at the Hong Kong Noodle Company, which was nearby. And it was boiled and then fried and then served with gravy.
Moneyman.
Is that what it was called? Okay, and it was very specific to the new moon. And he said people loved it and came from everywhere to eat this. Anyway, I don't know exactly what was on the menu, but it sounded like a lot of gravy dishes were on there. So this, I think, is the main dining room. This is my father, our father, Wallace Tom. This is at their wedding reception. The woman to the left of him, to the right here, is my mother. And as you can see, there's kind of like coffee urns and a counter. So it's still very kind of, you know, sort of old fashioned American style Chinese restaurant. And let me see, there they are toasting. I think those windows face San Pedro Street. Now, so my father was an artist. He ran the New Moon, but he really had an artist sensibility in terms of food, music, visuals, everything. So in the 50s, he worked with this architect, Eugene Choi, to modernize and redesign the New Moon. The New Moon had its grand opening in 1958, and Colin, feel free to jump in if you want to say anything. It's very modern, much more upscale than the original New Moon. There was people remember there was a koi pond over on the left-hand side. It was all glass. Let me see, here's the dining room. So this was all glass. And this bonsai obviously was just for the photograph. They had a lot of original art my grandfather was a patron of the arts. He bought a lot of artwork. Yeah, the high ceilings. You know, you can see these lighting fixtures were very mid-century modern. You talked about like the two types of Chinese food, like the kind of I can't remember the first one. The other one was sort of upscale Chinese with the shark fin soup. They went upscale, but not in a Chinese way. You know, we did not have shark fin soup, I don't think, on the menu.
Just for banquets.
Just for banquets. This really catered to a Western audience. Okay, this side faces San Pedro Street. let me see. The patrons were people who worked in the garment district, which was right across the street, the fashion district, suburbanites, because there were no Chinese restaurants in the suburbs in the 1950s. Some Japanese banquets, Chinese banquets, a lot of Japanese funerals.
A lot of, yeah, Japanese banquets. So people that worked in downtown, whether they be in finance, insurance, it wasn't uncommon for them to go back to the suburbs to get their families and turn around and drive back downtown for a dinner at the New Moon or a dinner at the downtown restaurants. Traffic was not nearly what it is today. And so again, not many Chinese restaurants in the suburbs at the time. People headed back downtown for that, and drive time was tolerable.
This is a shot of the kitchen. I think these were done, these were like, they almost look like publicity stills because everything looks so clean and spotless.
which is the way our restaurant
Yes,
was.
exactly. Here, you know, it was the menu, as you can see, the cover was, there's a little blurb here on the back. It talks a little about the artist. You can see where my dad was going with this whole.
We also
design.
opened up with a bar too, and I again, not being born at the time and not being a historian of the Chinese restaurants, but I would imagine that having a modern bar was something that not all the Chinese restaurants had, although I'm sure some did. But the bar was a pretty big feature of the New Moons.
So so you talked about lobster. I think there's lobster Cantonese. So I don't know if it was the Chinese version, the American version, or the Chinese version for Chinese people, but anyway, it was on the menu and I imagine it was popular. So you get a sense of that. So I wrote here, the menu's design, dishes, and writing reflect the sophistication of the restaurant's new, modern, and upscale design. And I was reading this little description here, and you have words like gourmet, art, finest Cantonese food, at the discretion of the chef. You know, I mean, these were not phrases or words you found in the old or New Moon or probably in many of the restaurants at that time. But again, this is really a reflection of our father, who had a pretty refined taste in terms of, you know, food and fashion and everything else. We see a few other dishes. Yeah, they had almond duck, lobster Cantonese, shrimp and black bean sauce. For those of you who ate there, you know, we have the beef steak cubes, and then of course our signature Chinese chicken salad, which my dad said put the three of us through college. Okay, and oh, so as much as they have these new sophisticated dishes, there is also kind of a nod to the more traditional dishes. So you can see I think there's Chop Suey on there. Yeah, there's Chop Suey.
Not so much traditional, but as much as the Americanized version, things that were less expensive dishes that many people would recognize from visiting other Chinese restaurants.
Yeah, and they grew accustomed to it. And then, so here's just the lunch menu. And then, oh, speaking of dim sum, as you can see.
Tea cakes.
Tea cakes. Yeah, we call them tea cakes.
We
not
did
dim
call them
sum.
tea cakes, yeah. Which is probably some translation from.
Oops, yeah, sorry, that's okay. And I think these are the steamers.
Yeah,
for the dim
so
sum.
you can see though that you know, on a large scale, those coverings that are hovering above the steamers were on some kind of a pulley system, so it could raise them, and they were allowed to steam large quantities. We hosted lots of banquets, but as well as steaming the dim sum, those were pretty convenient items. And I would imagine going back to that last one, the ovens to the left were large roasting ovens, vertical roasting ovens.
Okay, here's just a little detail. 10 cents. Oh, that was tea. I don't know how much these were. But, you know, it wasn't a really, you know, large menu offering, but I guess these were the ones. Okay, do you remember this, Eugene, eating any of these?
I was there only for banquets.
Oh, Bob, I'm sorry, Bob.
Oh, well, I remember getting these. I mean, there wasn't the multitude of tea cakes. I think at the time, my father said that you people were about the only ones who had them.
Okay.
I mean, other people had char siu baos and chicken baos, but they didn't have the siu mai and the fan guo and the ha
And-
gao.
Okay. And then
Yeah, and the menu,
what's that?
the menu is from the 80s, the 1980s.
No, earlier.
This is earlier.
Earlier. And yeah, earlier. It was
It's probably the
in the
60s, I would think.
Yeah,
60s, okay.
because the new moon opened in 58. So, and then Colin mentioned the bar. As you can see, this was a very popular feature of the restaurant. Again, you've got some art, statues, you know, these Chinese tables. There's another angle. And I just threw in the drink menu just to give you an idea. I don't know, how do you describe these drinks?
It's sort of a Polynesian, Asian. I think it's the mixture as our customers would identify Chinese food, and I think it was really popular because of the movies, Polynesian drinks. So I don't know how many people were going to Hawaii at the time, but you could see from the Mai Tais and the Planter's Punch and the Navy Grog, things that were popular of the day.
Okay. And then, so moving forward, Colin went to the Cornell. Sorry.
Yeah, my story is I'm third generation. So in high school, I decided that I wanted to go into the business, and I wanted to open up my own restaurants. And my father was just, much to his chagrin, he wanted me to do anything but go into the restaurant business. Typically, you know, go be a lawyer, be a doctor, something along, pharmacist, whatever it may be. But for God's sake, don't go in the restaurant business, because he had to. And being an artist at heart, as my sister said, it was something that he did because it was the family business. But he certainly wasn't very, his heart wasn't into it. And so I did, and I went from high school and I went to Cornell's hotel school, School of Hotel Administration. And so
That's the best in the world, Colin. I went to Cornell too. Yeah. So.
Oh, you did? Well, there you go. You know what you speak. Thank you. It was a cold 4 years up in Ithaca, New York. But after graduating, I stayed in the East Coast, and I worked in Baltimore, Maryland. I heard you reference Baltimore. I worked in Baltimore for another 5 years because I didn't want to go right back to Los Angeles and get put into family business or something of that sort. I wanted to learn more of the corporate restaurant method. And I didn't work for a Chinese restaurant. I worked for a group called the American Cafe at the time, and that was in 1983, 84, when I graduated, and I spent 5 years in Maryland. And then I came back to Los Angeles and didn't open the restaurant right away, helped out the family business, ran some underground dance clubs downtown, which was fun. And then I finally opened up my first restaurant.
You're moving. You're ahead of this.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is still the new moon. This is the old new moon, or the new.
1985. I was back. So forget the dates.
Okay. Well, anyway, the point of these slides is to see the little red asterisks. Colin, these were new to the menu. So as you saw, the old thing they had, like the Cantonese plant and curry shrimp.
Yeah, really seeing the landscape of the tastes, and I think that was mentioned earlier, were changing, and as more ethnic foods were coming in, spices were becoming a part of everyday eating, from whether coming from Mexican food or from other various cuisines. The Cantonese menus were void of anything that was spicy, but I could see that a lot of our customers, which were largely Caucasian or white customers, they were a little bit more adventurous. And so I started putting on some spicy dishes and really borrowing from other Chinese regional foods. And there we go.
So in 1993, the New Moon that you saw, that modern one, closed. And I think, you know, a lot of it had to do with competition. There were restaurants in the suburbs now. People were no longer going home and then coming back downtown. Downtown was getting kind of little that area was getting a little
Yeah,
sketchy.
neighborhoods were changing,
yeah.
and Chinese restaurants development
Oh, need to replace photo, sorry. I'll move ahead.
all over the place. You can see we didn't rehearse this very well, but brother and sister here. So yeah, so we the area was repurposed. The family owned the land, and so they repurposed the buildings and rented it out and eventually sold it. And I opened up my first restaurant in 1993. I looked for locations. I was actually looking in Santa Monica at the 3rd Street Promenade, but I opted to come back downtown in the Garment District, and I opened my first restaurant at 9th and Main Street.
Yeah.
And
And this is his lovely wife, Candace. And yeah, well, anyway, they went into business together and over the course of 28 years opened many restaurants. So their next restaurant was, I'm going to let you kind of talk from here on.
well, the next restaurant was Montrose, but going back to all these restaurants, I brought together a group of investors. My Aunt Helen, I think, is on here, so thank you, Aunt Helen, who pitched in as well. And all of the restaurants have had a pool of investors outside, which was not probably very typical for a lot of the Chinese restaurants, where they really just drew only from family money. But I sort of did a little different business model. So this is our Montrose restaurant. Montrose is a subgroup of Glendale, the northern tip of it, where it meets up with La Cañada. And that restaurant opened in 2005, pardon me, in 2005. A little larger restaurant than our downtown place, and it's still open today. So 16 years, and we have some other pictures to go with that.
Oh yeah, so we'll rush through because I know it's already at 8. So here's just,
Lots of
new
menu books.
menus. And then, nice press. I like how it says going back to Newman's roots. And then another one in San Marino.
We opened this restaurant in San Marino, primarily the suburbs. So while the Chinatowns were moving a little bit east from the downtown Chinatown, migrating to the San Gabriel Valley and sort of Monterey Park, Alhambra, then spreading further out all the way out to Walnut and further points east. I started opening up restaurants in the suburbs where I was more familiar with the type of clientele, places that I raised our kids to go to school. So we opened up San Marino, but before San Marino was our Valencia restaurant, which I think we've got a picture of Valencia.
I was just showing some of the menu
Yeah,
items.
some of the menu items. Again, they're staying with the larger menu. And I don't know if you can read that, it's kind of small print.
Here,
We'll just
yes.
move on.
There you go.
Yes, so spicy garlic shrimp on a bed spinach. Really what I did is I'd go to a lot of Chinese restaurants, I'd eat dishes, I'd like the dish. We didn't have camera phones to take pictures of it, but I'd write down what I could, take it back to my chef and say, hey, can we reproduce something like this? I really was knocked out by the dish. We would make 4 or 5 iterations of this dish, and I'd say that one is the closest thing to it. And so it really just became a menu of my favorites, of the dishes that I enjoyed eating, irrespective of exact region or staying true to a Cantonese dish. And I think that it resonated with a lot of our customers.
And just pointing out that the chicken salad remained, it was a constant through every iteration of these menus. We're almost towards the end. Here's the Valencia.
Yeah, that's our
restaurant.
Valencia restaurant. And you could see sort of the modern design. And then I started putting in
Sorry.
bars. No, it's okay.
Bar.
Yeah, bars. In that circle there, and you can maybe tell that was a jellyfish tank. So we had this really large jellyfish tank put in, and
Okay.
it was kind of unique.
So speaking of innovation, Jong, I think you mentioned like it's not called fast food, but it's called what?
Quick service.
Quick service.
Yeah, it's just a way to fancy it up.
So you want to describe which of these 2 restaurants are? This is the
Yeah,
San
that's the San Marino restaurant on the left. It's a smaller restaurant that we took over about 6 years ago. And then the one to the right is the New Moon Cafe. And I called it that because that's what the name of my family's original restaurant on San Pedro Street, 9th and San Pedro was. But there again, using brighter colors, a big wall graphic there that I fell in love with that one. And it's a quick service restaurant down at 7th and Fig in downtown in the financial district. Figueroa Street.
Yeah, so then here's just like
Some
little
ads, yes.
and then takeout menus.
Okay.
And then here's the last restaurant that Colin opened that he talked about a little earlier.
Yeah, so that's our Buena Park restaurant. So we were looking for other locations, and some of our regular customers are the Porto family who do Cuban bakeries. And so Raul and his family and his sisters and their families would eat at the New Moon in Montrose often. And they opened up a bakery, Porto's on Beach Boulevard in Buena Park. And we sat down over lunch and talked some business, and lo and behold, we opened up a restaurant on their property. And these are some pictures of it. We had a great designer named Sky Kogochi, a Japanese American from Hawaii. And he did the design on all of this restaurant. And he's doing our redesign in Montrose, the bar, so forth. So
Yeah, that's it.
That's it. Montrose pictures.
Oh, no,
No.
sorry.
It's okay. So that's what we have to offer.
Um,
Yes. And so just, to encapsulate the New Moon and what it's become is really a restaurant that reflects my life experience and what my father introduced me to. And that is not really being confined by regions. We're born here, Chinese Americans. We don't see the same borders. It's not that we don't respect and appreciate our history, because of course we do. But we, by the same token, if we like something, it tastes good to us, its sensibilities, we put it on the menu. And that's really the evolution of food. Food is such, as you mentioned before, it's such an evolving, dynamic thing. As available products or produce, proteins that are available, and taste change. And so I make no apologies for the style of menu that we have. Some people would say, is it authentic? And I just get a smile and ask if they like it. And if they do, great. And if they don't, well, I'm sorry. In fact, just really as a quick story, I once down at our downtown restaurant, I was noticing that we had a designer from across the street in the garment district, and she was a woman from China, and she would eat at our restaurant fairly frequently. And finally, I had the courage to ask her. I said, I really appreciate you being a regular customer. I said, our cuisine. I said, where in China does this remind you of? Like, can you help me understand, identify that place? And she took a moment, and then she looked up at me and she said, it's not like anything I've ever had in China. She said, but I like your food. And I laughed and I thought, you know what, I'll leave well enough alone and just accept the compliment and not push it any further. But I think that sort of tells a story about what I do now in my restaurants. But a big bar service and catering is also part of what we've done in the community. So thank you very much.
Yeah, somebody has a question. Is there a difference between quick service and fast casual?
Yeah, I think each of those, no, I mean, in short, no, they're not, but they're certainly all come from fast food. I think that we've distanced ourselves from the term fast food because of the empty calories, the high sodium, high fat, carbs and everything else. And so we're looking at really more chef-driven food, but served in a style that is a quick service. But fast casual certainly would fit that same category. Yes.
Bob, do you want me to step in now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. And I've been
Hey, Gene.
just fascinated. Yeah, hi, everyone. And good evening to all who are in the audience. On behalf of both the China Society of Southern California and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, of which I am a member of both, I'd like to welcome everybody. I see a lot of familiar names, and I'm going to get to some questions here, but I want to just kind of acknowledge the presence of a few people here in the audience. One of the features, one of the reasons why Chinese restaurants were able to build up their customer base, their business, their volume of their business, was because they had access to a supply chain of food. And because many restaurants were at the city market across the street, or in locations near rural areas where fresh produce was available. In the audience is Eileen Liang, whose late husband Peter Liang wrote One Day, $1, which was a book about the Chinese in agriculture in the Central Valley. And that was a period where many people really took advantage of this supply chain that was accessible and were able to provide all the fresh vegetables that went into things like Chop Suey. Also on the in our audience is Lee Wong, whose parents ran the Chungking restaurant in Riverside, in downtown Riverside for many years. And they've, the restaurant's been closed for a while. So hi, Lee, up from Sacramento. I know you're up there in that neighborhood. And there are other folks who are really tuned in from far away, like our member Doreen Dresser, who is in New Mexico somewhere, and our former board member, Stephen Eng, who is just moved into Lander, Wyoming. There are a number of other board members who are online, but I'm not going to spend time except to acknowledge the presence of Grace and Ricky Liu, who are new board members for the Chinese Historical Society. So I want to kind of relay some questions that have been asked. There is one where apparently there is a push to transition from gas lighting to electric heating for stoves, and maybe Colin and Pam, maybe you can best address that. How might that pressure affect your future?
I'm not familiar with that, but the transition or the different type of energy to go from gas to electric, I just couldn't imagine it. I mean, it's fundamental to wok cooking is the high intense heat and to be able to control it quickly. So gas provides that, electricity, something I'm not such a, it has its application in some types of ovens and warming ovens and things of that sort. I'm sure steaming ovens, you can use electricity, but for woks, I could not imagine. I'd use wood logs before I use electricity.
Yeah, or you can imagine walking down a street market in Taipei and having electric burners to heat up the food.
Yeah.
No,
Dorm
quite a
room,
different
but
experience. A question from Albert Chang: what was the reason the newer restaurants' names are not in Chinese? Any significance to that? Maybe Jong, maybe you might have noticed the change in names.
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
What was the reason the newer restaurants' names are not in Chinese? In other words, you don't have a New Moon name, but instead one that is straight out of Shanghai or Beijing. What's that trend?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Colin, do you want to give that a try first, or Pam?
Yeah, listen, the Chinese restaurants and they've definitely evolved. I mean, as the world has shrunk and with social media and things of that sort, I think that generations ago, the naming of the Chinese restaurants were literal translations that appealed to the owners from Chinese into English. And so you've got, names like Dragon and Pearl and Golden. And, there used to be a game where they would name 15 different of those. You put together any Chinese restaurant you want with a combination. Today, I just think that it's just a different world. So the significance of not having Chinese newer names, or Chinese names are not in Chinese. We're trying to grab our customers from a wider broader group, I should say, whether they be Latinos or people who don't speak Chinese. I stumbled on that one, but there you go.
Thank you, thank you, Colin.
Back to you.
when I co-curated the museum exhibit, we actually used a lot of menus, restaurant menus, and I paid very close attention to the ways in which people name the restaurants. Okay, so in the early first half of the 20th century, even in the 60s and 70s, people try to, by naming their restaurant in a certain way, people try to sort of present their restaurant and their food as something very exotic, right? So that was a very, very popular trend. Actually, people have also written about the funds that people used for restaurant names. There is a Chop Suey fund. Okay, but that's another story for another day. And speaking of the naming of restaurants, the newer ones, some of them coming from China and Taiwan. If you look at Din Tai Fung, right? So it's a transliteration. It's a transliteration because those restaurants before coming to the U.S., right? They already, Din Tai Fung, for example, its original store already had a Michelin star, right? And Haidilao, right? Haidilao is a globally recognized brand, right? So they don't feel the need to change their names. Just a transliteration, so the names speak for themselves. They have that reputation. And another thing that there's another trend. If you go to Chinese restaurants, the reputable ones, in Manhattan, and in other places, something different is happening. In the past, when people first open restaurants, they change the taste, right? They tailor their food to the taste of their customers, right? Now, people, when people from Taiwan and China open restaurants, they serve food the way it is served back home. So that goes along with the naming of the restaurants. Yeah.
Excellent.
That's an interesting insight. I have another question here from Joanne Litt. A lot of Italian food has become mainstream American, like pizza or maybe lasagna. Do you think that certain kinds of Chinese food will also become just food or just mainstream? Any thoughts on that?
Colin, Pam, give it a try first. You are the experts.
Can I jump in first? And
yes.
Maybe I recall that when U.S. military first jumped into Iraq, that we established a green zone where the American military would feel safe. And some of the things that they did was to open food vendors there. And of course, they're going to serve food that the American soldiers were comfortable with or familiar with. And that list included pizza joints, and burger joints and Chinese places. So that there was sort of an acknowledgement of how mainstream it actually is in our American diet. But maybe I didn't want to answer that whole question ahead of you guys because maybe you have some special insights here too. Do certain kinds of Chinese food will become just food in the US? Any thoughts on that?
I think, and from what I've just anecdotally, I've seen, fried rice and the various ingredients that you put in fried rice. So, obviously the rice and with some heat and toasting the rice and so forth. But beyond that, you can add in there the Cubans. My Cuban friends insist that the Cuban fried rice is the best fried rice. And if you go to Hawaii, you're going to get Spam fried rice, and now with kimchi fried rice. So fried rice seems to be one of the dishes as a vehicle where different cuisines, you could throw hamburgers in fried rice and break it up. Hot dogs, certainly in fried rice, is fairly common. If I were to pick one item, that might be it, because it takes on the character of whatever you want to put in it.
Yeah, and if you go to Mexico, you'll enjoy fritos,
That's right.
or
That's right.
in Peru, you like the chaufa. So
Yeah, I mean, it really depends, right? If you go back to the decades before the 1980s, right? Chop Suey, which to a large degree was an American invention, especially in the way it has been recognized and promoted, right?
Right.
So what is more American than Chinese food, than Chop Suey, right? There are 50,000 Chinese restaurants in the U.S. So in that sense, it's not just individual foods, but the whole cuisine, the Chinese American cuisine, has gone American.
Right.
Right. But at the same time, people like Gustavo Arellano, right, who wrote Taco USA, with whom I often have discussions, sometimes debates over food, right? He would say, well, maybe there are more Chinese restaurants in the US, but can you find things like salsa, right, in every single supermarket, right? I mean, the equivalent of salsa from Chinese cooking in every single supermarket? No, you can't, right? So there are certain things in Italian cooking, Italian food, in Mexican food, okay, that have become very American, almost totally American, right? And Chinese food has not done that, right? But Chinese food has achieved that in other contexts, in Peru, in Singapore, in Malaysia, blending with the local food traditions. Okay, in the U.S., what I would argue is that although you cannot find any food that's more American than Chinese. Okay, it's an ironic statement, right? Paradoxical in a lot of ways, especially today, in the political climate. But I mean, even in that case, I think Chinese food as a cuisine has remained very Chinese, in more so than other diasporic Chinese cooking in other countries. So it has more direct connection with the culinary tradition of China, and a major reason for that is the continued immigration from China. Because immigration is really so important for the global travels of food.
So you've just painted a picture, Jong, that Chinese Americans are mainstream. We are part of American society.
Yeah.
Our families, some of our families have been here for hundreds of years.
Yeah. I mean, there have been Chinese in the U.S. Before the gold rush.
Right.
In Connecticut, there was a mission school that was opened in 1916. I mean, 1816.
Well,
1916 is not.
Or in
1816.
Mexico or Central
1816.
America or the Caribbean.
And among the 100 or so students, 5 of them were Chinese. Go back to the beginning of the 19th century.
Well,
But I mean, so in a lot of ways, the Chinese Americans, are mentioned America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a good point to really reassert here that Chinese
this is
food or
something.
Chinese American food is mainstream.
Yeah, something particularly meaningful and important to keep in mind. Against the backdrop of the rising anti-Asian sentiments.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
So a little closer to home, here's a question from Warren Hong. whose dad operated the Hong Kong Low restaurant. But he also mentions that his mother, Shirley Hong, worked at the Hong Kong Low Deli, which was on Bamboo Lane. And that was a favorite place for dim sum tea cakes. I remember prior to going to work in the morning, I'd sometimes go in there at 7 a.m. and pick up some hot things, like cha sao bao or gai bao or hakao, whatever, and I became really popular at work, but because you had a load of hot dim sum. So I don't know if everybody remembers that particular deli in Bamboo Lane.
Of course I do. It's next door.
Yeah. And Bob, what was the name of the restaurant across the street?
Happy Valley.
Happy Valley. So, I see in the audience, I have Dodie, we see Dodie Thompson. And I remember meeting Dodie and her husband Murray there with some of his students a couple of times. So that was a favorite place because Happy Valley was open until 4 a.m., right? So I want to make a comment, by the way. Colin, one of your high school classmates is in the audience, and I told him I was not going to insult him, but
go ahead.
Yeah. And maybe one day he will be as successful as you have been. But he's been involved in LA versus Hate and working with various community organizations and agencies to address the anti-Asian wave that has hit some areas. Have you encountered any anti-Asian kinds of attitudes in your neighborhoods? And by the way, I should mention too, I apologize to the audience for taking up so much time, but you will have triggered so many positive thoughts. The Montrose location was always a favorite for my wife and me because she worked at Glendale College, and that was a favorite go-to place for many of the faculty and the staff, or whenever there was a birthday or an event, we'd head over there.
Thank you, Gene.
So yeah, and I'm not trying to make any points. I just sort of
that's okay.
wanted to share.
Plug away. Actually, to the opposite, the contrary of that, we've gotten a lot of support from our non-Asian customers when the topic has been brought up. So no, to answer your question directly, no, we have not faced any slurs or any kind of slights ourselves. And if anything, I've had people sort of volunteer that what they read is disgusting and it's upsetting and it doesn't reflect what most right-minded people believe in. And so that makes me feel very good, obviously. And I thank them for their support and their just the humanity of it. But I do have a daughter who's 26 who lives in New York, and I will tell you, I'm at times concerned, fearful, and I don't have her take public transportation, the subways or anything of that sort. And even just walking on the streets in Manhattan where she lives and works, I just tell her to be careful. So, I mean, it has touched our family just through that concern, but not directly, thank goodness.
Yeah.
You named a couple of menu items after your daughters.
Yes, I have. Thank you, Gene.
Yeah, I want to concur by adding that, as an educator, as someone who sometimes working other sectors, I have seen a lot of support from non-Asians for Asian Americans, for Chinese Americans, right? Chinese Americans in particular, I would say. In addition, though, I want to note that, as far as big corporations are concerned, silence itself, I think, it should be noted Dunkin' Donuts is developing an Asian boba tea-like kind of drink. It's becoming very popular. So developing Asian themes, right? McDonald's partnered with the Korean band BTS. Okay, it's doing the BTS meal, very popular. It's going to be launched in, I think, 42 some countries at the same time, right? But corporations like this, remain silent as the anti-Asian hate crimes sentiments rose. That's not acceptable,
Yeah,
right?
right.
James Gordon, but his segment on late night show, it's called Spill Your Guts, right? Talking about how disgusting Asian food. I mean, just to single out certain Asian food as being disgusting, that sort of thing, right? And behavior like that, cannot be tolerated. And so people may not be openly anti-Asian, right? But at times like this, especially when people try to exploit Asian culture, Asian food, right? To take advantage of such, they should show their support.
Yep,
I have one story related to food. It was an act of, anti-Asian, I'd say verbal assault. I was standing in line at Costco of all places early on in the pandemic, and the discussion was around the origins of the coronavirus. And, there was all this talk about the wet markets and the bats and, what Chinese, whatever. And one woman just kind of looked at me and she said, it's the Chinese fault. It's their fault. Those stupid Chinese, it's their fault. They eat everything. Those were her words verbatim. And I was just shocked. And I, of course, launched into I just came back with all sorts of stuff. But, I just thought, wow, that's what people think about the Chinese, that we eat everything and that we're disgusting and we're disease ridden and we spread, viruses. So anyway, that was my personal experience early on in the pandemic.
But you let her have it.
I sure did. She picked the wrong person. But yeah.
So are you recovering in terms of your sales or customers?
I mentioned earlier on, not in this segment here, but we started out in 2020 with 6 restaurants, and unfortunately we're down to 3. So, we've cut our units down in half, but the 3 that we do have are doing well. And I think a lot of it, like running any business, you have to look at the programs that were available to you. The PPP loans certainly were a great support to us. And yes, our customer base has come back. Or the communities, I really believe that you really have to be a member of the community, whatever community you're in. And that's sort of been our focus. And they've supported us greatly, at least the 3 that stayed open. So thank you. Yes, we're back and business is strong.
Okay.
Staffing is tough. So anybody's looking for jobs, please go to the restaurants and help out, because staffing is a very real thing, or lack of staffing.
I always leave good tips because I know how hard it is. So
Thank you.
Here's a comment from Greg Chin. The New Moon, both old and new. My family worked on the corner of 9th and San Pedro, the George Lee Law Office.
Oh, yes.
I ate at both the old and new restaurants thanks to my mother, who was his legal secretary. Yes, the Chinese chicken salad set the standard at the new opening. And let's see.
Great.
Let me read this. But also, I ate. Let's see. But then the cook's imagination prevailed at the restaurants. He spent lots of time at the Wing Chong Long, Man Fuk Lo, and Paul's Kitchen, and yes, went to the elementary school at 9th Street Elementary. This is Greg Chen with his sister Patty. So there is a family.
Great memory.
Connection. Okay, and another one. let's see, from Irene Lamb. Thank you, Jong Chen. Thank you for a most interesting presentation. And to Colin and Pamela, so happy to learn that the new moon lives. And my family would drive every Sunday for dim sum starting in 1958.
Oh my God.
We meet other families. We would meet other families there, a tradition that lives in my memory. Even as a kid, I thought it was a beautiful restaurant.
Wow.
Since 1958, that's a lot of dim sum.
Yeah. I should mention that the Chinese Historical Society did have a couple of dinners at the New Moon years ago, and your dad parked his Harley Davidson in the alcove.
That's right.
I don't want to embarrass you, but I thought that was the coolest thing.
Yeah.
So for him to then, after the banquet, here we have a crowd of people all suited up and having a great time. And then as we start winding down and we start paying the bill and everything, then you hear this roar, out in the side in the alcove. And
Yeah.
that was your dad
That was dear old dad.
kickstarting his motorcycle and
Harley.
yeah, his Harley, and he would roar off into the night. So
That's
So
right.
funny.
yeah, so shades of-
Destination unknown.
right. He was a kind of a James Dean kind of hero
Yeah.
to me.
Oh, thank you for sharing that,
Thank
Eugene.
you.
That's very nice.
And thank you
Yeah,
everybody who's.
It's really etched in the memory here. Let's see. Let me see if there's another. John is are the original New Moon restaurant and Wing Chun Lung market buildings still around? Are the buildings still standing?
Good question. They are, but not in their, they don't look like a restaurant. They were torn down. Oh, yeah, I guess the answer is no.
They have been torn down. Okay.
No.
Yeah,
It's late. It's 8:30.
yeah.
No, they were torn down when,
Yeah, in
There-
90 so we closed the restaurant
In
in 90, was it
93,
1990? No,
93.
91. Yeah, no, the
1991.
yeah, 1991. And so they're no longer existing, any of
The garment district has expanded a little bit, and so there are some buildings or newer buildings or rehabs of buildings on San Pedro Street.
Right,
So-
right.
I just do want to say about the Wing Chun Lung, they were really connected, the Wing Chun Lung and the New Moon. The New Moon sourced all their food, all their groceries from the Wing Chun Lung. So, that's that.
And we had family farms
And
that
we had-
source
We have,
food for the Wing Chun.
yes, we have family farms in Downey and in Laguna Beach that provided Chinese vegetables and stuff to the markets and to the restaurant.
We have a photo of your grandfather at the counter with a big stogie in his mouth.
Yeah.
That was him.
Yeah, so at the Wing Chun Lung. From Loretta Holtman, compare and contrast Chinese Muslim food and the Chinese food that we are familiar with today. Maybe you start with a young.
Professor.
Professor, yeah.
Compare and contrast Chinese and Chinese Muslim.
Right.
Yeah.
Muslim.
Well, I mean, it's a very sort of unique kind of Chinese food. Its arrival in the U.S. is fairly new, right? So and because it's Muslim food, it was able, the Chinese Muslim restaurants that I've known have been able to attract a lot of non-Chinese customers, who are from Middle Eastern backgrounds, from Muslim backgrounds for sure. Also, a lot of Jews go to Muslim restaurants. Speaking of the Jews, back beginning in the late 19th century, when Jews started to arrive in the U.S. in large numbers from Russia and from certain other Eastern European countries, they fell in love with Chinese food. Okay, and I think if Chinese Muslim restaurants had been available then, Chinese food could have been even more popular with the Jews by the time. Yeah.
Well, it's 8:40, Bob. I don't know if you want to call it. That means we've had 100 minutes of education and entertainment. So
We can turn this into a night market food experience.
Yeah.
I should really make a quick comment about Chinatown. LA Chinatown, where I am right at the moment, is coming back. But it's interesting that some of the older places and larger places have closed, and there are newer and smaller places that have opened up, whether it's Steep Tea, which has spicy beef noodle soup in addition to tea, or to Pearl River Deli, which is, a lot of these are just walk up and order fast takeout kinds of places. So the younger generation is kind of marketing in a different way. And I just wonder if maybe, is that an option for New Moon in the future? Maybe you're going to have a fast serve operation.
Well, certainly our cafe at 7th in Figueroa, or Fig at 7th, as they brand it, was an entry into that market, and it's easier for me to duplicate that because of cost and space requirements are smaller. So I think the large restaurants, the banquet style restaurants, they're really going to be difficult going forward. And they have been really in the last maybe 20, 30 years to have, the 200 to 500 seat restaurants, right? So yeah, I think that a lot of creative people like to have restaurants pop up in former spaces, and it's conducive for these smaller walk up type of restaurants. But for New Moon itself, I'm looking at a few opportunities, maybe even outside of the state of California, and we'll see how that materializes.
Yeah.
Las Vegas.
Maybe you'll become like Panda. And
maybe not. I have a lot of respect for what they've done, but
yeah,
I'm getting a little too old for those grand ideas.
Yeah. So, Bob, should I let you close?
I guess so.
I'm having a great
This
time, but
program has been so great, and I sometimes wonder why we don't have more programs on Chinese food. I think this is maybe the third one, the third or fourth one the Historical Society has had in many years, and and there were many topics that we weren't able to touch on. Pam sent me that New York Times article, and I really regretted that I wasn't able to include some of the other regional foods, and perhaps we'll have another program based on those. I hope we will soon. Anyway, I want to thank Colin and Pam and Jong Chen and Eugene for making this program so successful and so entertaining. China Society is taking a summer break. This is our last meeting until October, and I think for the Historical Society they're going to be in September. But I think that all of us are hoping to have good programs, maybe as good as the one we've had today. And I want to thank all of you again for making this program so entertaining and so informational.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Say goodbye. Say hi to all my friends out there.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Don. Don's my best man.
Hey, Rick.
Oh, everyone.
Thank you, Ellen.
All right. Hope to see you all soon.
All right.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.